And let me say thank you to all of you for being here today. I'm told that this was sold out. I'm not sure you had to buy tickets to be here, but in any case, almost every seat is filled. I hope that's an indication of the interest in the Arctic. In fact, I trust that it's an indication of how interested you are in the Arctic. Ambassador Brzezinski made a comment about how the place would be filled today when we got here. I said perhaps it's because they knew he was coming. But I want to thank him for his hospitality and the entire staff of the American Embassy during our stay so far. And I want to thank the government of Sweden for being so hospitable during our visit. When I travel, and because of the nature of my jobs over the last few years, I generally travel to seaports. And one of the first things I do to adjust to the time zone and to learn a little bit about the city is to go out in the morning and do my morning run, which I did this morning. Fortunately, the rain had let up a little bit, and the rain that we had overnight washed away some of the ice on the sidewalks, so I felt safe out there. But the first thing I made was, and you can't get very far from the harbor in this city, but I went down along the harbor. I looked at the ferries. I took a little smell of the air. The smell of the water, the smell of the harbor always brings back fond memories for a sailor. So that's one of the first places that I start. And I also thought this morning as I was running, a comment that Ambassador Brzezinski gave me yesterday when we first met and we were sitting around talking for a little bit. He said, "You can't really see a country until you see it from the water." So I was very fortunate that World Wildlife took us out for a boat ride here this noon. We went out through the archipelago, and it brought back many memories as well, because you can start in the harbor. But once you start in the harbor and you have the smells of fuel and automobiles and people living and everything else, as you start to go away from the city, the air becomes fresher, the water becomes cleaner, and all those memories come back to you, and you think about when you were a young man and used to take in the lines and go out to sea and do very important things for your country. And there are many days when I wish I was still out there. So now I get a chance every once in a while to have somebody take me out on a boat and get back in touch with the water. But I think the water is a good place to start. And the water is a good place to start when we start talking about the Arctic as well. Hilary LaBelle, who travels with me, is getting a little anxious right now because I've already departed from my script and talking about other things. But I think you would rather hear me speak from the heart this morning or this afternoon, and that's what I'm going to do for a little bit. Because my interest in the Arctic began as a sailor. Nearly 40 years ago, my first assignment in the United States Coast Guard was on a small Coast Guard ship in the Bering Sea, and the little island called Adak out in the Aleutian chain. And we had a chance to travel up into the Arctic during that tour, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. But my first experiences in the Baltic go back to 1996. In 1996, I was the captain of our great sail training vessel of the United States, the Coast Guard bark Eagle. And we were in the Baltic for many of you are probably familiar with the Cutty Sark tall ship races. And that was a special year because it was the 300th anniversary of the Russian Navy. And we had 113 tall ships that rendezvoused in Rostock, Germany, and then we raced across the Baltic to St. Petersburg, spent a couple of days in St. Petersburg. And one of the memorable events then was an evening where all the ship captains got together in the cabin of Ireland's sail training ship Asgard II. And we were sitting around in the cabin. I think there were a few adult beverages consumed that night. And as the night progressed, at one point I sat back and I started listening, and there were at least a dozen languages being spoken in the cabin amongst those sailors, but yet everyone seemed to understand each other. And I think they understood each other because they're sailors. They shared common experiences. And regardless of the barriers of language, we understood each other as sailors. And the next morning, I was interviewed by the BBC, and I was reflecting on that evening together. And the reporter said, "Well, Admiral, what did you learn?" Or, well, then Captain, what did you learn from that? And I said, "Well, I think I learned that If everyone was a sailor, we could solve most of the world's problems. And there's a little bit of truth to that. But what I've learned also that it's not only sailors that understand shared experiences, there are diplomats that understand shared experiences as well. And that's why I'm so proud and delighted to be working for the United States State Department as we take on this very important task of chairing the Arctic Council, because it takes more than sailors, particularly as we address the challenges of the world. It takes good diplomats working together, coming to common understandings in order to advance some very important issues that impact not only the 8 countries that surround the Arctic, but as we know, what happens in the Arctic does not just stay in the Arctic, it affects the rest of the world. So it's very important for us to collaborate together and to address these challenges. You know, there is a phrase that I love to use that I found in a letter written by John F. Kennedy in 1963. He was reflecting on another tall ships event. And John Kennedy was a sailor as well. He sailed as a young man. He was a Navy man during World War II. And many of us, particularly me, remember pictures of him sailing with his family off Hyannisport in Cape Cod during his presidency. So in 1963, it was proposed that there would be an event called, for the tall ships in New York, called Operation Sail. It was the first Operation Sail. And most people thought that it would be the last opportunity to gather the tall ships of the world in one location, and it was to celebrate the World's Fair, which is being held in New York in 1964. So Kennedy wrote a letter in support of Operation Sail, and there's a phrase in there at the end where Kennedy, and I quote, he says, "The sight of so many ships gathered from the distant corners of the world should remind us that strong, disciplined, venturesome men and women can still find their way safely across uncertain and stormy seas." That phrase, uncertain and stormy seas, it has always been remarkable for me, because John F. Kennedy, when he spoke and when he wrote, did not just speak and write literally, he also spoke and wrote figuratively as well. So while ships and sailors do in fact face uncertain and stormy seas, and those characteristics of sailors help them to get through those challenges, I think Kennedy was also thinking that our countries would face uncertain and stormy seas, metaphorically, and that those particular characteristics of sailors would help our countries to address those challenges and problems as well. So as I look towards the Arctic, in my sailor's eye, I see uncertain and stormy seas ahead. And how do we react to those uncertain and stormy seas? What do we do to prepare for those uncertain and stormy seas? Will tell us a lot about our character as countries and as people. And I look forward to the challenges that Secretary Kerry and President Obama have given me to take on preparing for the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. I was about to retire about 6 months ago. I was retiring from the United States Coast Guard after 40 years of service to the country. And I had done a lot of talking. I had been to Alaska a number of times to visit up there, and I was trying to advance Arctic policy. And I thought in May, when I retired, that my impact and contact with the Arctic would be finished. And then John Kerry, our Secretary of State, called me on the evening before my retirement and said, "Pap, you've been talking a lot about the Arctic. How would you like to do something about the Arctic?" So I'm very grateful that he's given me this opportunity. There are some days when I think I probably should have gone ahead and retired. They're quickly replaced by days which give me great joy and promise, and this is one of those days when I get excited because of everything that we have in store for us over the next couple of years. We have developed an agenda, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But what I would like to say first and foremost is that one of the things I learned as a ship captain is it's important to listen to people. It's important to listen to your crew. So one of the things that I've tried to do since taking on this job is to listen to a lot of people. First and foremost, I listen to the people in the State Department. There are people like Julie Gorley, who has been our senior Arctic official for many years. not a lot of years because she's obviously very young, but she's been our senior Arctic official, I think, for nearly a dozen years now, and she has great experience and had been working on an agenda. I came in at the point where we needed to gain a little more clarity in our agenda and set some priorities, and I was very gratified and happy to learn that there was a substantial agenda that was going to be addressed. But first and foremost, we needed to get the buy-in of the American people. And the important American people, when you talk about the Arctic, are in Alaska. One of the challenges for the United States during our chairmanship is to gain greater attention of the Arctic for the people of the United States. I can tell you that there is a great distance between most of the United States and its Arctic. In fact, I think Hillary told me it was 3,500 kilometers. Let me do the conversion. You know, I'm American. 5,000 kilometers, about 3,500 miles from Washington, D.C. to Barrow, Alaska. And I can tell you there's a lot of Canada in between. So culturally and psychologically, the people of the United States are distanced from their Arctic. And we want to close that distance a little bit during our chairmanship. So on 2 separate occasions for a week each time, I went up to Alaska. And it wasn't just to speak to the governor or the legislature, and I did that, but I also had an opportunity to listen to the native organizations, to industry, to the non-governmental organizations, and to gain their insight and find out what was important to them. After we had done that, I started taking that to the really important people in Washington, D.C., speaking to some of the think tanks and other organizations. And then finally, back in October, I rolled out my first international speech at an event called Arctic Circle, which was held in Reykjavik, Iceland. About 1,400 people in attendance from 40 different countries, which is another indication of the interest in the Arctic. And I was very excited about that. This is probably the most important step, this trip that I'm involved in right now, because I need to listen to the Nordic countries. I'm going to be able to visit 4 of the 8 Arctic countries during this leg of the trip, and then on to a 5th when I go to Moscow at the end of this trip for 2 days to speak to officials there. And it's really important to do a lot of listening. And I think that symbolically, figuratively, and literally, my first stop is here in Stockholm. And I wanted to come here first and foremost because I admire how well Sweden chaired the Arctic Council from 2011 to 2013. I think one of the groundbreaking events, one of the most important and significant things that's been accomplished by the Arctic Council is the Marine Oil Spill Prevention and Response Agreement. That, combined with the Search and Rescue Agreement, I think are 2 very important issues that address the primary challenge of a maritime environment in the Arctic. And Sweden was at the forefront. And from every report from people who were involved in the process, Sweden did it collaboratively, listening to everybody, taking everybody's insight, and then working between various factions to bring people to agreement. And you have to admire that. And I hope the United States can do as well as Sweden did during our term in the chairmanship. So this is a good first stop, and from here we'll go to Tromsø for the Arctic Frontiers event, then to Copenhagen, then to Helsinki, and then we'll wrap up the trip in Moscow. Listening all along the way and seeing how we might modify and work our agenda. So thank you for having me here today, and this is just a great place for us to start. People will ask a lot about climate change. And one thing I'll tell you before I get into the specifics of our agenda is that I'm not a scientist. I'm a sailor. I can only make observations. I can form my own opinions, but my opinions are generally based upon those observations. And what I will tell you is that 40 years ago when I went to Alaska, as I mentioned up front, on one of our voyages, we had to go up above the Arctic Circle to a city called Kotzebue, which is just north of the Bering Strait. Our ship became stuck in the ice in the Bering Strait. And I went on a helicopter flight to see if we could find ice leads. We could find no ice leads. We landed in Kotzebue to refuel, and as we descended into Kotzebue, and this was July of 1976, there was ice as far as I could see, out to the horizon. 38 years later, I went back there as Commandant of the Coast Guard, and we flew into Kotzebue about the same time of the year, as I said, about 38 years later. And as we descended from a very high altitude, and as I looked out towards the horizon, I could see no ice. Now, I went back in the records, and for 1976, the ice that we experienced was not an anomaly. That was normal conditions in 1976. And if you look at the statistics now, what I experienced in 2010 when we flew in there was not an anomaly either. It's the reality of the Arctic today. Pardon me. And I don't have to tell that to all of you, because the reality is that probably 10 years ago, I would not have been able to go out throughout the archipelago in January in an aluminum boat. In fact, when I was told that we were going to go out and ride through the archipelago, I thought, well, what sort of icebreaker are we going to be riding in? And I was pleasantly surprised to see the very nice weather, and we got a chance to enjoy quite a bit of the archipelago. It was a beautiful ride. And Tom, I think I saw you out there. Thank you so much for inviting us, and Risa for your commentary as well. So let me get into the themes of our chairmanship for the Arctic Council. We think we have an aggressive schedule. In fact, most of the people that I've talked to said, are you trying to do too much? Well, there's one person that this is important to, and that's John Kerry, Secretary Kerry. And when I went in to talk to him, he said, are you doing enough? So he took another view on this. I think we're doing enough. We're taking on quite a bit. And I think that everybody has been excited by the broad range of things that we're doing. And I think what we've done is we've taken a little bit of Sweden's leadership, we've taken some of Canada's leadership with its focus on the indigenous people of the North, and combined in a few new ideas of our own that we're looking forward to advancing. So the first theme for our U.S. chairmanship is, first of all, the theme that we're using is One Arctic with shared responsibilities, opportunities, and challenges. And I think that sums it up. There is one Arctic, now, but all of us share in the opportunities that the Arctic presents, the challenges that that environment presents to us, and we all have responsibilities for preserving it. And we've narrowed down our aims of the chairmanship into three focus areas. The first of these initiatives is Arctic Ocean safety, security, and stewardship. And we start with that because the acceleration of maritime activity in the Arctic enhances risk in what is already a harsh and challenging environment. And under our chairmanship, we propose to build upon the existing preparedness and response programs to enhance the ability of the Arctic states to execute their search and rescue responsibilities and emphasize safe, secure, and environmentally sound shipping as a matter of high priority for all the Arctic states. In addition, we aim to look at other areas of the world where coastal states have come together to coordinate responsible management, sometimes by creating regional seas agreements. And the United States believes that we should ascertain whether similar arrangements would help us to address the challenges of the newly forming ice-free Arctic Ocean. Our second initiative is to improve economic and living conditions for the people of the North. Today, a rapidly warming Arctic threatens traditional ways of life that have endured for generations. The changing climate is threatening the Arctic's rich biodiversity, including vital fish stocks and the life cycles and migration patterns of migratory birds and other subsistence species. Alaska communities are suffering severe coastal erosion, and thawing permafrost is becoming a major threat to infrastructure like roads, sewers, water, gas, and electricity systems. Under the U.S. chairmanship, we're interested in improving freshwater security and accessibility, telecommunications infrastructure, and renewable energy technology. Millions of Arctic residents rely on dirty, expensive, and inefficient diesel-generated heat and electricity. If we don't act, Not only do the direct energy costs affect them, but the long-term effects of black carbon on human health and accelerated climate change will make these communities harder to inhabit. Deployment of renewable energy technology in these communities can address each of these while promoting local economic development and job growth. And finally, our third initiative is addressing the impacts of climate change. It's imperative that we address the impacts of man-made climate change in the Arctic now before it becomes too late. We know that what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, and likewise what happens in the rest of the world does not stay just in the rest of the world. It affects the Arctic. Glaciers and land-based ice sheets in the Arctic are decreasing, contributing to global sea rise levels that will impact coastal areas around the globe. The actions of mid-latitude countries are driving changes in the Arctic, not only accelerating climate change, but affecting the lives of our citizens living in this already remote and challenging region. The Arctic environment is disproportionately impacted by black carbon and methane emissions. Reducing their emissions requires international cooperation, particularly on our Arctic Council observer nations. Now, this would take place first and foremost by continuing the Council's great work on the subject of black carbon and addressing key sources of these emissions. Within our climate agenda, we also plan to collaborate with our partners in enhancing community resilience to climate change and supporting the foundational science necessary for strong policy formulation. What I've just highlighted is only a snapshot of a much larger and robust chairmanship program the United States is preparing to launch in April. However, it's our theme that means most to me, as I believe that as our chairmanship ends, this is the message that has to carry forward even beyond the scope and authorities of the Arctic Council. One Arctic with shared responsibility, opportunities, challenges, and responsibilities. We all need to start thinking of ourselves as one Arctic, as no one country can manage the Arctic alone. At times, the world may seem to be growing smaller, but the amount of open water in the seas is getting larger, particularly in the Arctic, where an emerging ocean beckons with opportunity. The Arctic Ocean is changing from a solid expanse of inaccessible ice fields to a growing navigable sea, attracting increased human activity and unlocking access to vast economic potential and energy resources. However, those opportunities also bring challenges, and those challenges are not without risks. The acceleration of human activity in the Arctic, the opening of the seas, and the inevitable increase of maritime activity can and might result in maritime accidents, oil spills, illegal fishing, and illegal harvesting of other natural resources. Wherever human activity thrives, governments have a responsibility to uphold the rule of law and ensure the safety and security of its people. These growing challenges demand our attention and commitment, not only to meet our responsibilities to our respective nations, but to the Arctic environment itself. For the United States, this means reminding all of our citizens that the United States is an Arctic nation, with more than 50,000 Americans calling the Arctic their home, and whose ancestors learned through thousands of years to survive in one of the harshest environments thinkable. America is an Arctic nation, and we must quickly recognize this reality and act accordingly. Now, I'll be the first to admit that the Arctic is different for every Arctic nation, whether it's because of geography, population size, or the Gulf Stream. The European Arctic, the Nordic Arctic in particular, is vastly different from the North American Arctic. While rich in resources, parts of the American Arctic struggle to obtain the basic necessities such as food, water, and shelter. Our portion of the Arctic lacks infrastructure capability, from deep water ports to buildings that can hold crowds the size of this one in front of me. I understand we all have different challenges to overcome, but I believe it's our differences that unite us because we can learn so much from one another. As we learn to share best practices and to overcome individual challenges, we can also work together to overcome the adversity of the Arctic that impacts us all. A common challenge we all face is basic telecommunications for mariners attempting to travel in the Arctic and for many of the people who live on the shores of the Arctic. My years at sea taught me many life lessons, and chief among those is vigilance. the art of keeping a weather eye on emerging challenges so that we can adequately prepare and take early and effective action to prevent and respond to those challenges. As I scan the horizon at the start of 2015 and I think about what our efforts now and over the next 2 years are going to be, I'm reminded that what we really should be focused on is our responsibilities for the Arctic in 10 years, or 50 years, or 100 years from now. Now, all these challenges aren't impossible, and as I look across them, and I think that sometimes it's a little difficult or a little too hard to take, I always go back to John F. Kennedy once again, that sailor who always provided such inspirational talks. One of my favorites is from 1963 at Rice University, where he first challenged the United States with the Apollo program. And in that speech, he said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon and do all the other things that we have to do, not because it's easy, but because it's hard." And then he goes on to talk about when you face hard challenges, that's when you learn the most about yourself, where you learn new things, where you gain new technologies. And sure enough, the Apollo program did that for the United States and for the world. So the interesting thing is, oftentimes we know more about the moon than we know about the Arctic. And it's time that we take on the challenge of the Arctic. So I am just delighted to be able to be a part of the team for the United States that is preparing us for the Arctic Council. I'm delighted to be here today and to share some time with all of you and say a few words about our program. And Anna, I want to thank you once again for the invitation to come here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please have a seat there, and I will invite our commentators up. It's Ekaterina Klimenko, who is a researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. And I think Niklas Granholm, Deputy Director of Studies at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI. Perhaps you can take your seat as well now, and then both of you will... Yes, we'll do it like that. And we have the panel ready for a discussion. So please, but we'll start with Ekaterina.
Thank you very much for invitation for this great event, and thanks a lot, Admiral Papp, for this extremely enlightful presentation about the Arctic, U.S. Arctic chairmanship, Arctic Council chairmanship for the next 2 years. Just before continuing with my comments, I would like to present a bit the SIPRI's work on the Arctic that we have been doing for the last 3 years with support of MISTRA, Swedish Strategic Environmental Research Agency, which generally provided us with funds on our Arctic work. And within our Arctic work, we're mostly focusing on the consequences of the changing environment in the Arctic and how the Arctic states are to respond to the challenges and opportunities that they are facing due to the climate change. Now we are working on the two main directions. One of them is the Russia's Arctic policy, which I'm going to talk about in a few moments, and as well as SIPRI was one of the academic champions to look into the Northeast Asian policies in the Arctic, primarily the China's policy. And we are working now on research on how Russia and China could possibly cooperate in the Arctic in future. As Admiral Papp stated, climate change is already having a far-reaching impact on the Arctic region. In the decades ahead, the process of transformation is forecast just to accelerate and never to stop. And most dramatic regarding the near disappearance of the summer ice in large parts of the Arctic. The environmental transformation, as Admiral also mentioned, that brings both opportunities and challenges to the Arctic region, both when it comes to business development as well as to communities living in the Arctic. The shifting climate change of the Arctic will also bring with it sort of new opportunities for development of energy resources and shipping lanes. And Russia, the country I will be mostly talking about, will have perhaps a central role in any development of the Arctic, because it's difficult to deny that Russia is an Arctic superpower, especially reflecting the length of its Arctic coastline, the extent of its continental shelf, together with the probable allocation of the energy resources within the region. Russia's strategy adopted in 2008, as well as another version of the strategy adopted in 2013, put development of the Arctic resources and shipping lanes among the top priorities of Russia's policy in the region. And Arctic is already contributed up to 11% of Russia's GDP, and this share is only forecasted to increase by 2020. Russia's energy companies started ambitious program of resource development in the Arctic, particularly in the Barents and the Kara Seas. Prirazlomne oil rig would be one of the obvious examples of Russia's slow but progress when it comes to energy development in the Arctic, as well as the onshore resources of the Yamal Peninsula. In 2012, Gazprom has launched the Vavanenkovo deposit that will most probably be one of the first substitutions to depleting resources in other parts of Russia. Exploration of shipping routes is also seen as one of the top priorities in Russian Arctic policy, and as Vladimir Putin has put it several times, Russia wants to make Northern Sea route a sea route of strategic importance, of international importance, and that Northern Sea route would compete with other international shipping routes in terms of safety, commercial viability, as well as safety mostly. In face of new challenges, Russia is also reconsidering its security policy in the region and mostly responding to new challenges, such as opening of its northern borders due to receding ice and due to increasing economic and shipping activities. It has to improve on its communications and infrastructure, navigation infrastructure, as well as search and rescue capabilities. Despite taken quite aggressive stance on the Arctic in the beginning of its return to the Arctic region, over the last 5 years, Russia has been surprisingly, to many, surprisingly cooperative in the Arctic region. Russian government has repeatedly mentioned that there are no problems in the Arctic that require military solutions, and the Russian Federation is extremely interested in keeping the region as stable for its investment and economic development. Indeed, Russia has been quite supportive on all the initiatives within the Arctic Council, and primarily for the two agreements that Admiral Papp has already mentioned on search and rescue and oil spills. Russia has also been quite cooperative when it's come to the delimitation of the Arctic territories, and the agreement with Norway is one of the best examples. Russia and Norway has resolved the dispute that lasted for over 40 years, but understanding of common opportunities in the region has finally contributed to resolution of this argument. However, in 2014, events have slightly changed in the Arctic. As Admiral Papp mentioned today, what happens in Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, but also vice versa. What happens in other parts of the world don't stay just in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, Ukrainian crisis in Ukraine and Russian annexation of Crimea has made significant challenges and become quite a test for the Arctic cooperation and for Russia's aspirations in the Arctic. Because of the sanctions imposed by the US and the EU as a response to Russian action in Ukraine, and further, especially annexation of Crimea and further its actions within eastern Ukraine, Russia has lost access to extensive technologies that are only available in European countries. Arctic was one of the few regions where Russia really felt the impact of sanctions because of this ban on transporting technology for deep oil drill in the Arctic. And now it's sort of left on its own to develop its economic opportunities in the Arctic region. It's trying to pivot Asia and try to bring in Asian partners to develop its Arctic, but I'm not too sure to what extent it really benefits the Arctic, because neither Russia nor Asian countries have never been really famous for its following the environmental standards. So it will be difficult to see how this will be resulting in the Arctic environment, and mostly the following the environmental standards. And it was also, although Arctic Council has not really been impacted by Ukrainian crisis due to Canadian chairmanship took it as its goal to keep the Arctic Council going. Still, other platforms for cooperation in the Arctic, particularly the military cooperation and those platforms that discuss hard security issues, such as the meetings of Chief of Defense, some of the military exercises, has been suspended in the Arctic for the unknown time so far. This I see as one of the major challenges in the coming years, mostly because Russia is increasing its military activities in the region due to reconsidering military importance of its Arctic military forces, as well as a response to new challenges. So in absence of this kind of platforms for discussion, for sharing information between Arctic states, it will be difficult to avoid misunderstandings of intentions of each other. And this could result in more tensions between the Arctic states, although the Arctic region has enjoyed quite a high level of cooperation on all the levels, including the issues of hard security. I would also say that one of the challenges for the Arctic Council in 2015 and further, if the situation with Ukraine will not be resolved, will be to keep this spirit of cooperation going. It will be difficult to work when on a high level, when the tensions between the countries in other parts of the world are so high. That's why I think it's important to find more platforms for cooperation and more grants for cooperation, which in the Arctic are increasingly high level. One of them is, of course, strengthening both Russia and other countries of the Arctic Council are interested in strengthening the institution and making it a full-fledged international organization. All of the Arctic countries, including Russia, agree that addressing issues of climate change and environmental protection is important and collective effort, and needs collective effort. Safe shipping, one of the priorities that has just been mentioned for the US chairmanship, will be also one of the points where Russia and the rest of the Arctic states could cooperate in quite extensive way. Russia and US Coast Guard has already have a long history of cooperation in the Bering Strait, and this type of bilateral and multilateral initiatives should be one of the ways out of the chilling of the cooperation in the Arctic. In fact, in my view, since Arctic itself doesn't have so many controversies between the Arctic states, it could become a way out of international crisis that happens between Russia and the other Western countries. It could be the platform where we could start to re-engage Russia in many other activities and many other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katarina. And Niklas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just make sure that the...
Exactly.
So I hope you can all hear me now. Very good. Well, Anna, thank you for introducing us, and thank you for inviting me here. So Admiral Papp, Katarina, ambassadors and ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin using my allotted 6 to 8 minutes to speak here today, just a few words on where I come from. The Swedish Defence Research Agency, FY in Swedish, is a civilian government agency under the Ministry of Defence, and from this follows that I speak here today in a personal capacity. The FI was formed in 1945, and with about 800 researchers and analysts, we are one of the largest agencies of its type in Europe. So in my presentation here today, I'd like to focus on three main themes. Firstly, some of the factors changing in the Arctic, three major global actors taking an interest in the Arctic, the United States, Russia, and China, all with different approaches, policies, and resource bases for the Arctic. And thirdly, that the outcome of the changing Arctic presents the United States with an opportunity to influence the future of the region. As most of us are aware, a new Arctic is emerging. This is not a remote and theoretical possibility in some distant future. The change is happening now. Climate change drives the ice melt on land and at sea in the Arctic, and as a result, a number of follow-on effects can be clearly observed. New transoceanic sea lanes, opportunities for extraction of energy and mineral wealth are among them. The Arctic seabed isn't well charted, and efforts to fill in the nearly 90% of the Arctic's white spaces are ongoing. Who owns what part of the Arctic is another issue that has presented itself in recent years, and several overlapping claims for territory and extended economic zones are now under consideration. More human activity, broadly speaking, is to be expected, affecting living conditions for indigenous populations there, and the sensitive natural environment may be affected as well. The issue of hard security has also presented itself. Assertion of sovereignty has come to the fore, and a smaller and thinner ice sheet may in time also affect the dimension of nuclear strategic stability. New technologies such as development of ballistic missile defenses might also contribute to a changing military strategic role for the Arctic. But it will not necessarily lead to an increased risk of open conflict. To a large extent, it will depend on the events and developments outside of the region. And to paraphrase what Admiral Papp said earlier, what happens elsewhere may end up in the Arctic. A growing realization of the changes in the Arctic has in recent years spread around the world. The region is clearly on the agenda for policymakers, and national and corporate strategies have been formulated. On the international level, intergovernmental cooperation to meet the changing Arctic has led to a strong development of the Arctic Council in the past 6 or 7 years. The Arctic Council is now the club to be a member of, and where much, but by no means all, of the interaction over Arctic affairs takes place. In a forthcoming study by the Swedish Defense Research Agency, United States, Russian and Chinese strategy and policy for the emerging new Arctic is studied. The differences in approach of the Arctic Big Three, as we chose to call them, are striking. For China's part, defining itself as a near-Arctic state has meant a focus on science, business ventures, an increase in capabilities to operate in the Arctic, and generally a softer rather than harder long-term approach to Arctic issues. While no official strategy has been published, China's actions seem to be part of a newfound great power attitude. Opportunities globally are suddenly possible to contemplate. While contradicting Chinese national interests have somehow to be reconciled. While Chinese interest in the Arctic has certainly increased, other policy issues are higher on the agenda, and geographical realities limit her options. For Russia, which has the longest Arctic Ocean coastline by far and a long tradition of activities in the region, the contrast with China is striking. Here, an Arctic triad of sorts has emerged: energy, security, and shipping, with clearly formulated strategies guides implementation of the mid to long term. The main effort is on establishing the Northern Sea Route as a safe and secure sea line of communication. Transit shipping, energy and mineral resources, and protection from incursions is in focus. From a Russian perspective, an open Northern Sea route due to ice melt entails a number of challenges and opportunities, not least for economic development. In addition, Russian Arctic assertiveness has an element of national pride. While the Soviet Empire has been lost and flag planting in the Arctic can partly act at least as a compensation of sorts. The traditional seesaw of security versus economy in Russian strategic thinking currently seems to be favoring security. The only substantial military buildup in the Arctic today is undertaken by Russia. With central strategic interests in the Barents Sea region and on the Kola Peninsula in particular, this part of the Arctic will constitute a challenge for Arctic security in the years to come. Seen against the backdrop of Russian open aggression towards Ukraine, a general military buildup and an increasingly assertive stance in general, not least in the Baltic Sea region, as well as attempts at ignoring international law and agreements entered into, there are clear risks that this will affect cooperation adversely also in the Arctic. To what degree will the cooperative efforts in recent years be damaged by this? What can be done to mitigate such damage? The United States, as we heard Admiral Papp say, has an ambitious agenda for its Arctic Council chairmanship. This is a good starting point. Given the challenging dynamics leading to an emerging new Arctic, an ambitious strategy that draws on the United States' considerable resources is a must as I see it. With its traditions in crafting strategy and implementing policy, and with considerable resources to draw on, the United States is well placed to make an impact in the Arctic. But achieving this will not be easy. Being a world power, the United States' strategic in tray is almost always full or overflowing. How important is the Arctic relative to other pressing issues? Is there a grouping of interested United States domestic parties above and beyond the relevant federal agencies in the state of Alaska? And is it cohesive enough to drive the increased interest in the Arctic? The upcoming US chairmanship of the Arctic Council for the next 2 years will certainly help put the spotlight on the Arctic issues in the United States. With all the resources and know-how available, the United States will, once the Arctic policies gain momentum, have the potential to make a real imprint on the pattern in the Arctic region. We're not really yet at that point, in my view, but it is probably close. The US is simply too big and too powerful to ignore the changes in the region. It now sits on an opportunity to shape the future of the Arctic for the better. An Arctic based on rules and agreements that are honored will be an Arctic better suited to the fast changes it is now subjected to. With a number of new actors paying attention to the Arctic, the number of factors changing, predicting the outcome with any reasonable degree of certainty will be a challenge. Moreover, all these factors develop at their own pace and according to their own inner logic. How will the interaction between them look? Will they cancel each other out, or will they reinforce each other in ways we cannot foresee? One thing is clear. We cannot discard these developments and the regional and global effects. The new Arctic can no longer be seen in isolation from the rest of the world. So to sum up, a new Arctic is emerging, and how this Arctic will look and what role it will play in regional and global affairs is hard to predict due to the sheer number of near simultaneous changes. Optimistic statements on cooperation should not be underestimated, and so far the Arctic actors have largely played by the book. But what happens in a crisis, if we had one? In my view, it would not be prudent to overlook the risks in the dynamic we see now. Secondly, major state actors in the region and outside of it have different approaches and traditions in dealing with the Arctic. Will we see a clash or cooperation when these meet in the Arctic? And lastly, the United States sits at an almost unique set of capabilities and opportunities to give an active contribution to shaping the future strategic setup in the emerging new Arctic. And by now I'm almost certainly beyond my allotted speaking time, so I look forward to the panel discussion and developing these themes and try to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niklas, and thank you, Katarina, also for raising various range of interesting topics here to explore further. We have both the balance here between cooperation, as I think everyone actually agrees has been the way that the modus operandi of Arctic Council so far, and the question mark ahead, will that continue, or will we see a period here of increased conflict and confrontation also in the Arctic Council setting? Where do you think this will land? And Katarina also had some concrete suggestions there on moving towards an international organization or safe shipping and these kind of initiatives. Could that help? And then I think also as you raised the big countries, or the pivot to Asia, which we are usually connecting to the United States, we see that more on the Russian term here in the Arctic, and the reach out to China. And what is the American view on that, and how do you apply the pivot to Asia thinking in the Arctic spectrum? It would be interesting also to hear your view on your considerations there. But please, I think I'll give the floor back to Admiral Papp to respond to comments or pick up questions if you have any reflections on what has been said so far. And then you can add on. Just raise your hand.
Nicholas and I had a chance to chat yesterday, so many of the points that he made today are no surprise, and I've had a chance to consider them, and they're well thought out and will be very helpful as we go forward. Katarina brings up some great points as it regards Russia. In any organization, in fact, what I've told people when I've lectured on leadership over the years is the toughest leadership job is in a volunteer organization. And I'm used to being in an organization where when I said something, people would do things. Now we have to cooperate, coordinate, talk things through, and gain consensus. But I like that challenge. It's good. We need to have all 8 countries come to consensus on the issues that we're going to address. So having Russia as a partner in that is very important. The United States, along with most of the countries in the world, and particularly the Arctic countries, take exception to the aggressive actions of Russia in Ukraine, and rightly so. And there have been sanctions that have been imposed. However, I think most well-reasoned people understand that you never want to break communications completely with anybody, because that leads to misunderstandings and misinterpretations. If you have, going back to my sailor experience, if you have a line, if you have a piece of rope that's under a strain, and the strands start parting, and you're down to the last strand, you don't want to pull harder. You want to ease off a little bit and keep that line so that perhaps you can still use it. I view that the same with communications with Russia. We are under a strain right now, and when you are under a strain, the worst thing you can do is put more strain on the line. And I think the Arctic Council, because of our unique situation, particularly dealing with an environment and a part of our planet, that it is in the best interests of all 8 countries to cooperate for the good of this planet. I think there's incentive for Russia to comply. The question is, both my fellow commentators, when they addressed Russia, are talking about a buildup of capabilities on the Russian side. You can't understand capabilities completely unless you understand intent. And I think intent is subject to interpretations and sometimes misinterpretations. And that's really the tough part to deal with. So Russia will be interesting. But we are intent, the President Obama, Secretary Kerry, all want to keep that line of communications open. And we will work very hard on our side to do that so that we can advance not only the issues that we're going to take on in the Arctic Council, but hopefully it will provide incentive to address some of the other larger issues of the world as well.
Thank you. Any more comments on that? Yes.
Just to continue talking about whether it will be, on your question, whether it will be more tension or cooperation, I hope rationality will prevail and Arctic countries will keep cooperating, because in the Arctic it's really impossible to move forward with any initiative, not including all the Arctic countries. It's impossible to work on climate change without cooperating with Russia, on the search and rescue without cooperating with Russia, and I think everyone in the Arctic understands this now. And so far, neither Russia nor other Arctic states were interested so much into stopping all the lines of communication, as Admiral Papp mentioned. But there is also a risk that this level of cooperation will decrease to a certain extent. It will not be probably that much of meetings or communication on the lines of military, but Arctic Council will sort of help to mitigate this. That's my hope, and that's also one of the possible scenarios of these events. And then we shouldn't forget, yes, intentions, of course. What are the Russian intentions? What of the Russian military capabilities in the Arctic at this point is not only and not so much about the Arctic, it's about other parts of the world. The only difference is that they are there because of the military fleet has been historically there. They are there because the nuclear strategic forces has been historically there. So if it's not about the Arctic, there is nothing really to argue about the Arctic. That's why most probably this will not be a conflict in the Arctic, and it will continue with the some certain level of cooperation there.
Yes.
Anna, I neglected to answer part of your question, which was the Asia pivot to the Arctic.
Exactly.
To me, it comes as no surprise. I think 4 years ago, I visited Singapore because we have Coast Guard people, United States Coast Guard people, that are stationed in Singapore because it's the major transshipment point of Asia. That is their business. That is what they're all about. So yes, China has been at many of the events, but so has Singapore, so has Korea. The Asian countries are very interested, and I don't think it's just because of the climate. I think it's because at a strategic level, the Arctic promises shorter sea routes. Shorter sea routes will lead to different distribution models. Could Iceland someday be the future Singapore? If you have a transpolar route from Asia to Europe and the United States, does Singapore become that point where you do does Iceland become that point where you do transshipment? I don't know, but it's fascinating to think about. And every time I go to an event, the Singapore delegation asks me to have breakfast or dinner with them because they are very interested. And they will tell me, first and foremost, they're worried about the seas rising because they're a very low-lying country. But then we shift to maritime traffic considerations. And I think a lot of people are looking at the Arctic and they're saying, well, it's the Northwest Passage is not going to be usable for another 20 or 30 years. The transpolar route is not going to be available until there's no summer sea ice, and they tend to become complacent and push that off as some future problem to deal with. I think the people of Asia have a longer view of things than particularly the people in the United States. We tend to take on short-term problems, work very hard at them, and then turn to the next one. Whereas, as I said in the speech, we should be thinking 10, 50, and 100 years from now and starting to plan for that. And I think that's why we're seeing the interest in the Asian countries up there.
So the short-term perspective on the passage for the shipping is not really there yet. It's a longer-term perspective that you have to think of. It's not that much
no, I wouldn't
on that.
I wouldn't say that completely. I mean, we've seen a fourfold increase in traffic in the Bering Strait. And in my mind, there are a lot of people that are focused on oil exploration and the potential for a man-made disaster because of oil drilling. I think the companies will deal with that as they go along, but as we sit here today, there is potential for a ship casualty or ship collision, and some of these ships that carry heavy marine diesel or marine fuel, can carry thousands of barrels of fuel on board. It's not just tankers. Every ship that goes up there has large fuel tanks and fuel capacity on board, and I see the potential for a marine casualty being the highest potential right now, and I'm not convinced that we are entirely prepared to deal with that. One only has to go back a few years to the Selendang IU, which was a ship transiting the Great Circle Road, and it ran aground in the Aleutian Islands. It was carrying, I think, 64,000 tons of soybeans. The soybeans didn't do too much damage to the ocean, but the 1,000 tons of fuel oil on board that ship did significant damage, and that was a relatively small ship. So it's not just the drilling, and yes, with the North Sea route opening and more ships beginning to use it, I think we need to focus on that.
And also the search and rescue capabilities combined. Nicholas, please.
Yeah, I think that there's another factor here that may play into the advantage of managing the Arctic. We now see a very much lower oil price, so it really isn't profitable at the moment to continue to do it in the Arctic anymore. And it seems to me that this is for the foreseeable future here presents an opportunity to avoid a risky scramble for extraction, and I would argue for using the time that's been gained here now in this with the economic cycle to use it for further discussions on setting up rules that promotes the safe methods for methods for extraction as is humanly possible here. We may have won a number of years here. Secondly, I think that what we're seeing now will mean that we will see a damage to the cooperative setup that we've seen in the past, build-up of cooperative functions that we've seen in the past decade or so. And again, I come back to this, not least the military strategic role of the Arctic is also affected. So what can be done to promote confidence-building measures of one type or another for the Arctic, or at least rules of the road to avoid misunderstandings and or worse. And I think there are some things happening here. One thing that the IMO Polar Code is something that will help actually sort this out.
What is that?
The International Maritime Organization is setting up a standard code for operating in the Arctic, what kind of demands they place on the ships that operate up there. And that hasn't been around, and that's a boon to the insurers as well, because they now know what kind of baseline they have to put, and this will put into effect in the next year or two, as I understand it. But there's also another thing that to mitigate the damage that will be done here, I think that a tried and tested method here is to put different issues for the Arctic in different boxes. If you can separate the issues of science, of the cooperation in the Arctic Council with other security measures and so on, I think that the damage could be insulated. Tried and tested idea of building ships is to have watertight compartments, and if you have a similar setup here, going with the nautical analogies here, that could perhaps be a help in sorting this out. Yeah.
Connected to the falling oil prices and the pressure that puts on the Russian economy is, of course, the Western sanctions on Russia. Do we see effects of the sanctions also in the Arctic context, Katarina?
Sure. First of all, as I already mentioned, Russia doesn't have any access to drilling technology anymore in the Arctic, and it was primarily working with Rosneft was working with ExxonMobil and with some Norwegian subcontractors that were providing the equipment to drill in the Arctic. So now this work has been suspended for unknown period of time. So of course they feel this effect. Then another quite dangerous, I would say, consequences was that Prilast-Rolme oil rig, renovation of this oil rig is now very difficult because Russia doesn't have access to technologies, and this is the oil rig that is already working and extracting oil. So any major disaster happening there will affect the whole Arctic, so that's the consequence. But I don't think that Russia will stop completely working on this direction. They will try to find other partners. It will be difficult for them to do it on their own, but they will continue working on the on shore. And this is mostly the work on Yamal Peninsula and building up the LNG plant there, but probably not so much work on the shelf.
And China has limited capacity there to help.
China has limited capacity. In fact, it's very few European countries that have this technology that could work with Russia there.
I think it's Norway who has the most
Yes.
advanced stuff in Europe. Yeah.
I think we will open up the floor for comments, questions, and we will have microphones. And please introduce yourself with a name and if you represent an organization. I'll take a couple of questions in a row and we can have a discussion from the panel. So up there, lady up there can start, and next to her.
Thank you. Admiral Papp, thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. My name is Therese Jakobsson and I come from Greenpeace here in Sweden. So we and many with us are very concerned about Arctic oil drilling, first and foremost, of course, for climate reasons, but also because of the risks of devastating oil spills in the vulnerable Arctic environment. So with your great experience and expertise, I would just like to know, how do you regard Arctic oil drilling, especially in icy waters, and the huge risks that that entails? Thank you.
Any human endeavor within the Arctic is 10 times more challenging than almost any other place in the world. I learned that as a young sailor. I never experienced weather as bad on a sustained basis any other place during the remainder of my career. I was glad to start out that way and have increasingly better weather conditions as I continued my career. With as much preparation as we did back in 2011 for Shell Oil to begin drilling in the Chukchi Sea, in fact, if you can go online, the New York Times had a story, I think it was 2 weeks ago, it did about the Kulloch drill. Fascinating story. It brought goosebumps to my arms as I was reading it, because I understand what it's like to be out there and to face those kind of challenges. And I was sending young men and women out there in the middle of the night in helicopters in those conditions to extract people from that rig. So anything that you do up there is a challenge and a great risk, and has to be done with a lot of preparation and foresight. And when you're doing something new like that, in spite of what the oil companies, and I've spoken to all of them, Shell, Exxon Mobil rather was just in my office this week. ConocoPhillips, BP, I've spoken to them all, and starting probably 5 years ago, and there was much greater confidence 5 years ago than there is now because of the Kulloch experience. And in spite of all the effort that you do in those human endeavors, you're going to run up against some sort of situation that you did not anticipate. Each one of them told me they had experience in southern Alaska and other places, off Norway, in the North Sea, you name it, people have experience doing it. But when you have a 300-acre iceberg or sheet of ice coming down on your drill platform, it's quite a different situation. So are we prepared for all those things? I think we are prepared, but you can never be sure. And we have to continually work. And that's why, as one of our projects for the chairmanship, we would like to exercise that oil spill agreement. Actually get people out there, do greater research on methods for cleaning up oil spills, greater experimentation and looking at what are the technologies out there. And the decrease in oil prices, as Nicholas said, has given us some breathing room. Will we be smart enough to take advantage of that breathing room and do all the efforts that need to be done in preparation for the next time someone drills up there? And I will say guardedly, I hope so. Governments are always slower at acting than entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are always more agile and forward-leaning than governments. Governments generally, we cannot afford to do that in the Arctic. So we'll continue to work, we'll continue to keep the pressure on, and I know, at least within the American Arctic, our Department of the Interior is working up very rigorous response plans that companies will have to comply with before they start drilling again.
Okay, please.
Thank you for a very interesting presentations. My name is Anders Bjurner. I'm a former diplomat and ex-deputy state secretary to foreign affairs, now in the civil society when I've retired. For obvious reasons, the Arctic Council is a unique organization in the sense that the indigenous peoples are represented in the Arctic Council. And it would be interesting, you have not touched much on that here. With these very rapid developments in these regions, climate-wise, the oil drilling, etc., where do you see the main challenges dealing with these problems in the perspective of the indigenous peoples, and what do you think could be done about it? Thank you.
Okay. I won't begin to pretend that I'm an expert on the indigenous peoples of the North, at least not from the entire 6 permanent participants. Obviously, we keep the permanent participants fully engaged in our processes as we work the issues before the Council. What I will tell you, that at least for me, I have focused on the people of the American Arctic, and I know a little bit about them. I know about them because of my previous experience in the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard was involved, along with the State Department. The Coast Guard transported the State Department up to Sitka, Alaska in 1897 to accept the territory from Russia, and we've been involved up there ever since. And our relationship in Alaska for nearly 150 years has always been working with the Alaskan natives and making sure that we understand them and that we're meeting their needs. So it was natural for us, as we started about 5 years ago, to start working on a Coast Guard Arctic strategy to engage with the Alaskan Native community up there, to make sure that we were helping them and not hindering them, and that anything that we do takes into consideration their thoughts, their opinions. We did a lot of listening, and we continue to do that. So in this job, it was not new for me to go up there and talk to our Alaskan natives. The challenges that we face up there are, I sort of describe it, if you know the theory of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where at the absolute top is self-actualization, and you go through various stages, relationships, security. At the bottom is food, water, and shelter. Everybody wants to self-actualize when we talk about the Arctic. They want to deal with these global issues, where the reality for Alaskan natives is they are literally looking for food, shelter, and water, and we need to be cognizant of that as well. We have Alaskan natives that are dying because of communicable diseases, because fresh water is so expensive to get into their homes that they don't wash their hands. Simple health procedures are ignored. We have, even though Alaska produces 17% of the petroleum we use in the United States, Alaskans pay the highest price for fuel, and most of their villages and towns are powered by diesel engines, and they pay for very expensive fuel, and they're producing black carbon, which exacerbates the challenges that we're facing up there. So quite literally, we have to find ways of getting them reliable sources of water that are not expensive, ways to deal with sewage in a thawing permafrost environment, and to find renewable alternative sources of energy so that we can lower their costs and protect the environment and provide for the future. So, at the end of the day, while I'm really proud and honored to be involved in these global issues. In my heart, a lot of these things that we're trying to do help those people of northern Alaska who are in need of all these things. Telecommunications, something that I think Sweden can help us with greatly. There are no fiber optics in Alaska. They're still building terrestrial towers for microwave transmissions. I go up there, I can't even use my iPhone because I get 1G coverage, maybe 1 bar if I'm lucky, and I can't transfer data. But it's like that. It's the day-to-day life of some of our Alaskan natives up there. So we are taking them in consideration as we work our way forward. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I'm doing your job.
Yes, I think we add up a few questions before you ask. I have there and up there.
Okay.
So 3 of them, and then we can sum it up. Yes, please. Okay, we'll start here then.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I am the ambassador of South Korea. As was mentioned during your kind presentation, South Korea is one of the countries who have a keen interest in developing Arctic, and we also admitted to the permanent observer in 2013 thanks to the very wise leadership of Sweden. And my question is about the governance of Arctic issues. Seems to me there are proliferation of new initiative and new cooperative project. There are Arctic circles, Arctic frontier, and also WF Institute one council that is Global Agenda Council in the Arctic. So it seems to me there are a proliferation of similar efforts and similar ideas, similar cooperative projects. So as a president of the new the Arctic Council, which is a main intergovernmental forum and as well as a decision-making body, how do you cooperate with competing ideas and initiative with those that I just mentioned during your 2 years presidency? Thank you.
Thank you. So on the governance of the Arctic Council and overlapping structures, and then please, if you post your questions, we will sum up and you will answer the questions all in a row. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, hi, it's Alistair Scrotton from from Reuters. I just wondered if actually Nicholas or Katarina could elaborate a bit more on how they see the short-term possibilities on the sea route, in the Northern Sea Route. I think last year was the first time in about 8 years that the number of voyages actually fell. It's been hyped up a lot, obviously, from the hopes of several years ago. Are we just going to see that current level for the next few years? I think there were only 5 trips between Asia and Europe using non-Russian ports last year. Is this the kind of level we're going to see in the short term? Essentially, are we going to see stagnation? And what's holding it back? What's the main thing that's actually holding it back? Is it sea ice, security, search and rescue? I had another question, if you have time for it, which is China. China's company's just bought up the iron ore in Nuuk in Greenland, taking over from London Mining. It has a huge embassy in Reykjavik. But you did talk about the issue of Russian and how Russia sees its own backyard in the sense of the Arctic. Is there a difference between China and Russia in its attitude towards the Arctic? Does Russia see it more in terms of national security, with the dangers that can involved, as we've seen in the perceptions with Ukraine, and does China really just see it as trade? As in, do we have to be anything to be worried about? Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. And then the last question, please.
My name is Dr. Charlotte Glaser. I'm an independent advisor and researcher of innovation and international business strategies, and I've recently been focusing on new space and new space strategies. I also been in the Air Force for 8 years less than General Papp, so 32 years in the Swedish Air Force. And I'm very intrigued about space and the developments, and I wonder we see very big overlap here between the nations being in the Arctic Council and the nations going through their agencies to ISS. And luckily, despite conflicts and tensions, we see that American and Italian, European and Chinese astronauts go up to the ISS from Russia. Just recently, some months ago, so that cooperation works well. And I would like to ask your view or your intentions for this upcoming chairmanship of the Arctic Council. What can we learn from international space governance cooperation and ISS in relation to developments in in this region of the Arctic? And my additional question is, JFK is an airport, but the president had a very big ambition of driving not only national agendas and national pride, but also forcing innovation. And that's what we see in new space in the US. NASA is sizing down the personnel, and we see many new commercial ventures and companies trying to catch up with the Russians on spaceships going up to the ISS. And we hope we'll be also the Chinese there in some time. So how can this agenda of driving innovation and spurring collaboration to new ideas and promising futures for humanity be enhanced through your chairmanships? Your chairmanship.
Thank you. That was a very broad question, but at least we have the first one. Is there anything to learn from space cooperation?
And Arctic region, very severe conditions and great opportunities, and not only in extracting mining or oil and natural resources, but human innovation and taking us to the moon type of examples, and mobile phones for everybody.
Thank you.
Well, we have another hour, don't we?
Exactly, and we have 1 minute now for answering all questions. But if you just perhaps touch on each subject very shortly, we can round it up like that. I think we start with Admiral Papp, and then we go over. Should we start Nicholas and then end up with Admiral Papp?
I think we should show Ekaterina on the Northern Sea route in China first, and I'll take it from there.
Katerina, please.
On the Northern Sea route, yes, indeed, last year was really sharp decrease on the shipping along the Northern Sea route, and there are several reasons for that. First of all, the ice condition wasn't so good that year, and it was really difficult to ship through this. Second, many Russian icebreakers were involved not into the escorting of the ships passing the sea route, but helping to build the Yamal LNG and the seaport of Sabeta. Most of them were involved into building that, and they were getting much more money from the energy companies to work there rather than from the shipping companies passing through the Northern Sea route. And again, the lack of infrastructure and the lack of really commercial viability of this shipping route is still holding it back, and most probably going to hold it back for another couple of years at least. Then on China, it's very interesting. Russian policy on China's involvement into the Arctic has been quite different from the beginning, and it has changed a lot nowadays. First of all, Russia was quite, I would say, detending China from entering the region, from working in the region, and most of all because it's a big country, it's a global player now, and Russia was sort of, Russian officials and then Russian academics as well, that was quite a they didn't want another big player at the Arctic table, so to say. But recently this position has changed a lot, mostly because they saw new opportunities from Chinese involvement into the Arctic region, and this was done not through mostly the governments, but through energy companies which are so close to the Russian government. And Rosneft have been cooperating with CNPC for so long, and now they're interested to attract Chinese companies to work in the Arctic. President Putin also mentioned that all the Asian countries, including China, are more than welcome to invest into infrastructure along the Northern Sea route. So this perception has changed, but I wouldn't say that it has changed completely. Still, Russia overall, not only in the Arctic, is looking at China with great caution and with great embarrassment, to be honest, because they're getting more and more a supplier of energy resources to China rather than equal partner to them. So there will be still, just because of this feeling of national pride, I would say, still holding back on cooperation with China there.
Yeah, I think you covered most of the things here on this, but of course there's weather and there's climate. We know that the ice is slowly melting, but that doesn't mean that there can't be cold winters with lots of ice or ice conditions where the winds shift and whatnot. Any sailor knows this, that this is actually shifting. So you have to keep your wary eye on the weather and climate here as well. Long term, I think it's an issue of building up the infrastructure, and it will be mainly the energy and mineral extraction that will feed into this, because otherwise the container shipping isn't what we're going to see beginning this route. That will probably come later. So it'll have its ups and downs, but I think long term we will see the Northern Sea route opening up. Later on the Northwest Passage, more ice, and the term I picked up recently, the Beaufort Gyre, which sort of feeds the ice into the Northwest Passage, and a great circle through the northern pole, a transpolar circuit. That will probably be longer. Someone might figure this out, but we actually, going back to climate change and ice prediction, we actually don't know. There are risks of non-linear changes here, as we saw. So suddenly a lot of the ice disappears. So there are surprises out there, perhaps. We won't know it until we see it. On China, I think, to sum that up very quickly, I think that if you look at Chinese actions in Africa, how they operate for extraction of natural resources and farming and whatnot, that type of strategy is something that will be adapted, and you can see elements of that versus Greenland and Iceland today. So I think that is something that we should look more for. I could take the opportunity as well to answer the space question as well very briefly. Yes, the Arctic in space is something that should be explored, and I think you can sum it up in 3 words: very much smaller, it's faster, and a lot cheaper. You go from microsatellites to nanosatellites. Faster in the sense that you can have a decision made and actually launch in weeks or even days. They're smaller functions, and this is something that is way beyond the sort of tailor-made, very long-term, 10-year projects, multi-billion euros that the ESA, for instance, and NASA as well is also working on. So you could have this much faster, and this means that there are opportunities for improving Arctic telecommunications, search and rescue, and who is doing what to whom up there, as maybe that could act as a CBM. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And then last words to Admiral Pupp.
We didn't forget South Korea.
No.
First of all, let me thank you. South Korea has been a great partner, one of our partners on the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. I had a tremendous visit to Seoul just 2 years ago to learn more about the Korean Coast Guard, and we appreciate your partnership. And I know you were talking about governance, but as I've been going through all these other questions, I hope your question has been answered as we've gone through here. To space, I agree with Nicholas on most of that, and what I would say is that going back to my discussion about oil drilling, entrepreneurs in a free society will look for opportunities. So in the absence of government action, NASA in particular, looking at other projects, the commercial community has filled the void. And is doing it because there's the potential for making money. And the commercial endeavors will always be able to be more adroit and agile than governments as they try to function, because we have a longer bureaucratic process. What I see is we have a need for information, whether it's telecommunications, whether it's better satellite communication, navigation. Most of the satellites that are in place now were optimized for the middle latitudes, not so much for the higher latitudes. So we have problems with navigation, even charting. I have confirmed by going to the Navy oceanographer back in Washington that some of our datum on charts up in Alaska goes back to British Navy charts with depths that were taken by lead lines by Captain James Cook on his second voyage in 1787. So, and they haven't been updated since then. So we have a lot of work to go in terms of understanding our Arctic and making sure that people can operate up there safely.
Mm. Sorry.
Well, I think the comparison you made was that these countries are cooperating in space. I would say it's an analogy between space and the Arctic. It's because it's a conflict-free environment. Heaven help us that we make sure space stays conflict-free, and I think it's our goal to make sure that the Arctic remains safe and secure and conflict-free. So I think well-meaning people and countries will always endeavor and do their best when we have those sorts of goals in mind, and let's hope we keep it that way.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Admiral Papp and the panel.
Thank you.